It is this, the feeling of being watched. You are alone in a room, or walking down an empty street, or sitting quietly by yourself, and suddenly you have this unmistakable sense that someone is observing you, that eyes are upon you, that you are the object of another's attention. And when you turn around, sometimes there is indeed someone there watching, and sometimes there is no one at all. But the feeling, the sensation itself, it was quite real, quite visceral, quite undeniable. Now, the question that naturally arises is, what is this sensation? Where does it come from? Is it some sort of sixth sense, some paranormal ability to detect the gaze of another? Or is it something else entirely? Something that reveals a great deal about the nature of consciousness and the fundamental structure of your experience. I want to suggest to you that this feeling of being watched is not actually about being watched at all, at least not in the way you might imagine. It is about something far more profound, far more fundamental to the human condition. It is about the structure of self-consciousness itself, about the way you have learned to experience yourself as an object, as something that can be observed, as something that exists in the gaze of others. Let me explain what I mean. From the earliest age, you have been taught to see yourself from the outside, to experience yourself as an object in the world, rather than as the subject experiencing the world. Your parents looked at you, evaluated you, judged your behavior. Your teachers observed you, graded you, told you whether you were doing well or poorly. Your peers watched you, formed opinions about you, included you or excluded you based on their perception of you. And through all of this constant observation by others, you learn to observe yourself in the same way. You learn to see yourself as others see you, to evaluate yourself as others evaluate you, to judge yourself as others judge you. You internalize the gaze of others until it became your own gaze, constantly turned upon yourself, constantly watching, constantly evaluating, constantly judging. This is what we might call the internalized observer, the watcher inside your own head. It is the part of you that is always commenting on your performance, always evaluating how you appear, always concerned with how you are coming across, how you are being perceived, whether you are doing it right, whether you are acceptable, whether you are worthy. And here is the crucial point. This internalized observer, this sense of being watched from within, it gets projected outward. You experience it as though the watching is coming from outside, as though there are actual eyes upon you, actual judgment being directed at you from the external world. But in truth, what you are feeling is your own self-consciousness, your own habit of self-observation, your own internalized sense of being an object under scrutiny. Now, let me be more specific about how this manifests. You are in a public space, perhaps, and you become suddenly aware of yourself. You become conscious of how you are standing, how you are walking, what expression is on your face, how you appear to others. And with this self-consciousness comes a feeling of exposure, of vulnerability, of being seen. But who is seeing you? Often, no one is actually paying any attention to you at all. Everyone is caught up in their own experience, their own concerns, their own self-consciousness. What you are actually experiencing is your own attention turned upon yourself. You have become both the observer and the observed, the watcher and the watched. And because this feels uncomfortable, because this self-consciousness creates a kind of tension or anxiety, you project it outward. You imagine that the discomfort you feel is coming from being observed by others, rather than recognizing that it is coming from observing yourself. This is why the feeling can be so strong even when you are completely alone. You walk into an empty room and you feel watched. There is no one there, and yet the sensation is undeniable. What is actually happening is that your habit of self-observation, your internalized sense of being an object under scrutiny, is so strong that it continues even in the absence of any actual observers. The watcher you feel is not outside you, it is you, watching yourself, experiencing yourself as an object that could be watched. Now, this raises a very interesting question. Why do we develop this habit of constant self-observation? Why do we learn to experience ourselves as objects that can be watched and judged? The answer, I think, has to do with the way human consciousness has evolved, the way we have learned to live in social groups, and the way we have constructed the very idea of the self. You see, in order to function in a social group, in order to navigate the complex world of human relationships and social hierarchies, it is useful to be able to see yourself from the outside, to imagine how you appear to others, to adjust your behavior based on how you think others are perceiving you. This capacity for self-reflection, for seeing yourself as an object, it has tremendous survival value. It allows you to fit in, to avoid social rejection, to manage your reputation, to navigate the intricate dance of human social interaction. But what begins as a useful tool gradually becomes something else. It becomes habitual, automatic, constant. You are no longer just occasionally stepping back to see how you appear. You are constantly monitoring yourself, constantly watching yourself, constantly evaluating and judging your own performance. The useful tool has become a burden, a source of chronic anxiety and self-consciousness. And more fundamentally, this constant self-observation creates and maintains the illusion of the separate self, the sense that you are a distinct entity, separate from the world, separate from others, an object that can be observed and judged. You experience yourself as split. There is the you that is living and acting, and there is the you that is watching and judging, the you that is living and acting. And this split is the root of an enormous amount of psychological suffering. Let me describe this more carefully. When you are truly absorbed in an activity, when you are completely engaged with what you are doing, there is no sense of being watched. There is no self-consciousness. There is simply the activity happening, the experience unfolding, a child at play, an artist lost in creation, an athlete in flow in these moments. There is no watcher and watched. There is just pure doing, pure being, pure presence. But the moment self-consciousness arises, the moment you become aware of yourself doing the activity, the whole thing changes. Suddenly there is this split. There is the you doing the activity, and there is the you watching yourself do the activity. And with this split comes self-judgment, comes concern about how you are doing, comes worry about how you appear, comes anxiety about whether you are good enough. And this split, this sense of being watched, it can arise from within even when no one is actually watching from without. You have so internalized the observer, so deeply learned to see yourself as an object, that you carry the watcher with you wherever you go. You are never free from observation because the observer is not outside you. It is a habitual pattern of your own consciousness. Now here is where it gets even more interesting. This feeling of being watched, this sense of being observed, it is not entirely illusory. In a certain sense, you are being watched, but not in the way you think, not by other people, not by some external observer. You are being watched by consciousness itself, by the awareness that pervades all experience, by what we might call the witness. You see, there is an aspect of consciousness that is always present, always aware, always observing. This is not the thinking mind, not the judging self, not the internalized observer I have been describing. This is something more fundamental, more primordial. It is the simple fact of awareness itself, the light of consciousness in which all experience appears. Everything you experience, every thought, every sensation, every emotion, every perception, it is all appearing in this awareness, being known by this consciousness. And in a very real sense, this consciousness is watching everything. including what you think of as yourself. But it is not watching in a judgmental way, not watching with concern or anxiety or evaluation. It is simply witnessing, simply being aware, simply knowing what arises. The problem is that we confuse this pure awareness with the judgmental observer, the internalized watcher that is constantly evaluating and criticizing. We take the simple fact of being conscious, of being aware, and we overlay it with all this judgment and evaluation and concern about how we appear. We turn the innocent witnessing of consciousness into the anxious watching of the self-conscious mind. And when you feel like you are being watched, what you are actually feeling is a confused mixture of these two things. There is the pure awareness that is always present, always witnessing, and there is the habitual self-observation, the internalized observer, the constant monitoring and judging of yourself. These get tangled together, and you experience the result as the feeling of being watched. Now, what is one to do about this? How does one relate to this feeling when it arises? The first step is simply to recognize what is actually happening. When you feel watched, notice that very often no one is actually watching. Notice that what you are experiencing is your own self-consciousness, your own habit of self-observation. See it clearly for what it is, rather than projecting it outward onto imagined observers. The second step is to begin to distinguish between the pure awareness that simply witnesses and the judgmental observer that evaluates. Notice that underneath all the self-conscious monitoring, underneath all the anxious concern about how you appear, there is a simple awareness that is just present, just here, just knowing what is happening without judging it. This pure awareness, this simple consciousness, it has been here all along, but it has been obscured by all the mental activity, all the self-observation, all the concern about being watched and judged. When you can recognize this pure awareness, when you can rest in it rather than in the anxious observer, something remarkable happens. The feeling of being watched begins to dissolve. Not because you have stopped being conscious, consciousness is always here, but because you have stopped confusing consciousness with the judgmental observer. You have stopped experiencing awareness as something threatening, something that watches you with critical eyes. You recognize that awareness is not separate from you, not something that observes you from outside or inside. Awareness is what you are. You are not the object being watched. You are the awareness in which the sense of being watched appears. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. You are walking down the street and you suddenly feel watched. The habitual response is to look around nervously, to wonder who is watching, to become self-conscious about how you are walking, how you appear. But instead of this habitual response, you could simply notice the feeling. Ah, there is a feeling of being watched. And then notice, who is aware of this feeling? Where is the awareness that knows this feeling is present? And in asking this question, in turning attention back to the awareness itself, rather than getting lost in the feeling and the story about the feeling, you might discover something interesting. You might discover that the awareness is not watching you in any threatening or judgmental way. The awareness is simply here, simply present, simply knowing what is happening. And you might recognize that you are not the object of this awareness, you are the awareness itself. This recognition does not come through thinking about it, through analyzing it intellectually. It comes through direct experience, through a kind of shift in identification. Instead of experiencing yourself as the watched, you experience yourself as the awareness in which the sense of being watched appears. And from this perspective, the whole thing looks very different. The feeling of being watched might still arise. It is a habitual pattern, deeply ingrained, but it no longer has the same power, the same ability to create anxiety and self-consciousness. It is recognized as just a feeling, just a sensation, just a pattern of mental activity arising in awareness. And awareness itself is not disturbed by it, not threatened by it, not caught up in it. Now, I want to address something important. Some people might say, but sometimes when I feel watched, someone really is watching me. Sometimes I turn around and there is indeed a person looking at me. Surely this proves that the feeling is a real perception, a genuine detection of another's gaze. And yes, this does happen. Sometimes the feeling corresponds to an actual observer. But I would suggest that this is not evidence of some paranormal ability to detect being watched. Rather, it is evidence of how attuned we are to subtle cues in our environment, how sensitive we are to the possibility of social observation. You are constantly processing enormous amounts of sensory information, most of it below the threshold of conscious awareness. You are picking up on tiny movements in peripheral vision, on sounds, on subtle changes in the environment that might indicate the presence of another person. And because you are a social animal, because the presence of others has always been important for your survival, your nervous system is highly tuned to detect these cues. So when you feel watched and then discover someone actually was watching, what has likely happened is that you picked up on some subtle cue, a reflection, a sound, a change in air pressure, something registered below conscious awareness, and your brain interpreted this as the presence of an observer. The feeling arises first, based on this unconscious processing, and then conscious awareness follows, and you turn around to confirm what you unconsciously already sensed. But this does not change what I have been saying about the nature of the feeling itself. Even when there is an actual observer, your experience of being watched is still filtered through your own self-consciousness, your own internalized observer, your own habit of experiencing yourself as an object that can be watched. The external gaze triggers and amplifies your internal pattern, but the anxiety, the self-consciousness, the discomfort, these come from within, from your learned habit of self-observation. Think of it this way. A person who has not developed the habit of chronic self-observation, who does not carry around an internalized watcher, might notice being watched by another with simple curiosity or interest, without the anxiety and self-consciousness that most people experience. The external observation is the same, but the internal response is entirely different because the internal pattern is different. This is why some people seem remarkably unself-conscious, even in situations where they are being intensely observed, performing on stage, speaking in public, being the center of attention. They have not internalized the critical observer in the same way. They do not experience being watched as threatening or anxiety-provoking. The external gaze does not trigger the same internal response. So the feeling of being watched, whether someone is actually watching or not, is fundamentally about your relationship with yourself, about how you have learned to experience yourself, about the patterns of self-consciousness you carry. And understanding this is liberating, because it means you are not at the mercy of external observation. You are not helpless in the face of others' judgments. The power is not in their watching, it is in your own internal patterns of self-observation and self-judgment. And these patterns, though deeply ingrained, are not who you are. They are learned, habitual, conditioned. And what is learned can be unlearned. What is conditioned can be reconditioned. You can begin to shift your relationship to yourself, to loosen the grip of the internalized observer, to recognize yourself as awareness rather than as the object of awareness. This is, in essence, what meditation and contemplative practice are about. Not escaping from awareness, not becoming unconscious, but shifting the locus of identity from the object being observed to the awareness itself. Recognizing that you are not the watched, you are the watching. And the watching, the pure awareness, is not judgmental, not critical, not anxious. It is simply present, simply here, simply knowing what arises without needing to make it into a problem. When you rest in this awareness, when you recognize yourself as this rather than as the object of observation, the feeling of being watched loses its power. It might still arise as a sensation, as a feeling, but it is no longer believed, no longer taken as truth, no longer able to generate the anxiety and self-consciousness it once did. And paradoxically, when you are no longer caught up in self-consciousness, when you are no longer obsessed with how you appear to others, you actually become more natural, more authentic, more genuinely present, because you are not performing for the imagined observer anymore. You are not constantly monitoring and adjusting your behavior based on how you think you should appear. You are simply being, simply here, simply doing what you are doing without the constant commentary and evaluation. This is what the ancient wisdom traditions mean when they talk about being natural, about wu wei, about effortless action. They are pointing to a way of being in which there is no longer this split between the watcher and the watched, between the actor and the audience of one. There is just pure activity, pure presence, pure being, and this is experienced not as being unconscious or unaware, but rather as being more fully conscious, more fully aware than ever before. Aware, but not self-conscious. Present, but not self-observed. So the next time you feel like you are being watched, do not simply accept the feeling at face value. Do not immediately look around for the observer. Instead, notice the feeling itself. Notice the self-consciousness that arises with it. Notice the sense of being an object under scrutiny. And then gently ask, who is aware of this feeling? What is this awareness that knows the sense of being watched? And in that asking, in that turning of attention back to awareness itself, you may discover something quite wonderful. You may discover that you are not the object of awareness, not the victim of observation, not the one being watched. You are the awareness itself, the consciousness in which all of this is appearing. And from this perspective, there is no one to be watched, no one to judge, no one to be found wanting. There is simply this awareness, being aware of itself, consciousness knowing itself, the universe experiencing itself through this particular form, and in this recognition, the feeling of being watched is revealed